They told him to strip, right there in front of everyone, made him stand half naked in the palace courtyard, while tourists filmed from behind the gates. And when they reached for his trousers, he finally said one word, no. That's when the palace commander stormed in, took one look at the tattoo on the guard's spine, and froze. What happened next? Before we reveal that, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. And hit that subscribe button, because we post stories like this every single day. Now, back to what exactly happened. The morning inspection at Buckingham Palace should have been routine. Just another diplomatic visit. Another group of foreign officers observing the changing of the guard. Another chance for the brass to show off British precision to allies, who were mostly there for the photo opportunities. Lance Sergeant Callum Brandt had done this hundreds of times before. Stand at attention. Let the dignitaries walk past. Endure the occasional question about ceremonial protocols. At 38, he'd learned that most visitors saw the red tunic and bearskin hat and assumed they were looking at living museum pieces, toy soldiers playing dress-up for the cameras. That was fine by him. The less people understood about what he really was, the better. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of London traffic mixed with the polish and wool of military ceremony. Tourists pressed against the iron gates, phones already out, waiting for the spectacle to begin. Inside the courtyard, everything moved with clockwork precision. Guards taking positions, officers checking formations. The eternal dance of British military tradition. But Brigadier General Matthew Arleston wasn't most visitors. The American had arrived with the kind of swagger that comes from too many years believing your own press releases. Silver hair cut to military regulation, chest full of ribbons from conflicts most people couldn't name, and the attitude of someone who'd never met a tradition he couldn't improve with American efficiency. His entourage was impressive. 3 aides, a defense attaché, and enough security clearance to make palace liaison officers nervous. But it was his reputation that preceded him. Arleston was known in intelligence circles as someone who got results by asking uncomfortable questions and pushing boundaries other officers respected. "This looks more like a parade than a security detail," he announced to nobody in particular, loud enough for the guards to hear. No radios, no modern equipment, just costumes and ceremony. Major Kent, the palace liaison officer, kept his voice diplomatically neutral. He'd dealt with difficult allies before, but something about Arleston's tone suggested this wasn't going to be a routine visit. "These men are all active-duty infantry, sir. Combat veterans, many of them." "I'm sure they can march in formation," Arleston replied, his eyes scanning the rows of motionless guards. "That doesn't mean they're not hiding something." His aide, Colonel Morrison, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, perhaps we should proceed with the scheduled tour." "In a minute," Arleston cut him off. "I want to understand what we're really looking at here." That's when he stopped walking and fixed his attention on Brandt. There was something about the way the guards stood that bothered him. Too still, too controlled, the kind of discipline that didn't come from parade ground training, but from places where moving at the wrong moment could get you killed. His posture was perfect, but there was an alertness in his stillness that reminded Arleston of snipers he'd worked with in Afghanistan. "What's your name, soldier?" Brandt didn't respond, didn't even blink. His eyes remained fixed on a point, somewhere beyond the palace walls, as if the American officer didn't exist. "They're not permitted to speak while on duty," Kent explained, stepping closer. "It's part of the ceremonial protocol." "Convenient," Arleston said, stepping into Brandt's personal space. "Makes it hard to ask questions." He began circling Brandt slowly, like a predator sizing up prey. The guard's posture never wavered, shoulders back, eyes forward, breathing steady. But anyone who knew what to look for could see the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his hands remained perfectly still at his sides despite the provocation. Other guards maintained their positions, but the atmosphere in the courtyard had shifted. Even the tourists pressed against the gates could sense something was wrong with the carefully choreographed scene. "That's a lot of fabric for a modern soldier," Arleston said, raising his voice so the other dignitaries could hear. Heavy wool, multiple layers, could be hiding anything underneath. He gestured to the other foreign observers, a Canadian general, an Australian defence minister, a Japanese military attaché. In today's security environment, we can't take anything for granted, even ceremonial positions. Major Kent's expression tightened. Sir, these guards undergo full security clearance before every ceremony. There are established protocols for verification. Protocols written when the biggest threat was a cavalry charge, Alston interrupted. Modern threats require modern responses. Electronic surveillance, concealed weapons, communications equipment could all be hidden under that costume. The word costume hit the courtyard like a slap. Several guards remained motionless, but their breathing patterns changed slightly. For men who'd sworn to protect the crown, the word carried particular sting. Sergeant Williams, stationed 20 feet away, felt his jaw clench. He'd served 2 tours in Iraq before joining the guards, had seen friends die for the flag these tourists were photographing, but he maintained position, trusting that someone with more authority would intervene. I'm here under joint intelligence cooperation agreements, Alston continued, his voice carrying across the courtyard. If you want continued American support for your security arrangements, then transparency isn't optional. Kent pulled out his phone, typing rapidly. He was already sending messages to superiors, but bureaucracy moved slowly and the situation was escalating quickly. Arleston gestured to one of his aides. Scan him. The aide, a young Air Force captain named Martinez, approached reluctantly. He'd done security sweeps before, but never like this. Never in public, never with cameras rolling, never with a man whose stillness suggested he could break them both without changing expression. Martinez ran a handheld scanner over Brandt's uniform, the device beeping softly as it detected the metal buttons, brass fittings, and regulation equipment. The scanner remained silent for everything else. No electronics, no contraband, nothing but wool and brass, and the steady heartbeat of a man who'd learned to control his breathing under pressure. Clean, Martinez reported, stepping back quickly. Surface scan, Arleston said dismissively. Doesn't tell us what's underneath all that pageantry. He stepped directly in front of Brandt, close enough that their eyes met for the first time. The guard's gaze was steady, professional, but there was something in those dark eyes that made the American pause, just for a moment. It was the look of someone who'd seen things that didn't appear in after-action reports. The kind of stillness that came from standing watch, in places where the enemy could be anywhere, anyone, anything. I want the tunic removed, Alston announced. The words hit the courtyard like a physical blow. Conversations stopped. Even the tourists behind the gates went quiet, sensing that something significant was happening. Kent stepped forward, his diplomatic composure cracking. General, that's highly irregular. These men are on ceremonial duty, not criminal suspects. And I'm responsible for international security cooperation, Alston shot back. If your guard has nothing to hide, this shouldn't be a problem. Behind the gates, phones began rising. Tourists sensed drama unfolding and started recording. A mother pulled her young son closer, unsure what they were witnessing, but certain it wasn't normal. The guards remained motionless, but tension rippled through their ranks like electricity. Sergeant Williams caught the eye of Corporal Davies, a question passing between them without words. Davies gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. They would maintain position until ordered otherwise. This is unnecessary, Kent protested. We have established security protocol. Your protocols failed to account for modern threats, Alston interrupted. Strip him down, now. 2 American aides approached Brandt, their movements hesitant. Captain Martinez and Staff Sergeant Brooks had done security sweeps before, but this felt different. Wrong. Like they were crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed. But orders were orders. The first button came undone, with a soft click that seemed to echo across the silent courtyard. Brandt didn't resist, didn't speak, didn't move except to allow the aides to work. His breathing remained steady as they unfastened the brass buttons one by one, revealing the plain white undershirt beneath. The red tunic that represented centuries of British military tradition slid off his shoulders like discarded skin. What they revealed told a story that no dress uniform could hide. The build was unmistakable. Compact, functional muscle, developed not in gymnasiums, but in the field. Arms that had carried heavy equipment over long distances. Shoulders that had absorbed the recoil of weapons most civilians never saw. The kind of physical conditioning that spoke of serious military service. But it was the scars that made people stop breathing. A burn on his left shoulder, faded but unmistakable, the kind left by white phosphorus or chemical exposure. Impact marks on his right arm that suggested close quarters combat. A thin line across his collarbone that looked surgical, probably from shrapnel removal. Each mark told a story of violence survived, of missions completed, of a man who'd walked through hell and came out the other side. Interesting collection, Arliston observed, studying the scars with the detachment of a pathologist. Looks like our ceremonial soldier has seen some action. The Canadian general, standing nearby, leaned toward his aide. "Those aren't training injuries," he whispered. "That's combat damage." Arliston heard him and smiled coldly, which raises the question, what exactly is a special operations veteran doing playing dress-up for tourists? He gestured to Martinez. "Keep going." The captain's hands shook slightly as he reached for Brandt's belt. That's when something changed in the guard's posture. Not movement, but a subtle shift in the quality of his stillness, like a spring being compressed. "I need to see his back," Arliston said. "Turn him around." They guided Brandt to face away from the crowd, and that's when everyone saw it. The tattoo wasn't large, maybe 4 inches across, but its precision was unmistakable. Black ink formed a geometric pattern that looked like no standard military insignia anyone recognized. 3 interlocking triangles arranged in a downward configuration, with a small string of numbers and letters running beneath, C3VI Blackthorn. To most of the onlookers, it was just another military tattoo, probably from his regular army days, before he joined the Guards. But Captain Martinez went pale. His grandfather had served in military intelligence during the Cold War, had shown him classified documents before they were destroyed. He'd seen markings like this before, in files that weren't supposed to exist. The Canadian general's aide, a colonel named Harrison, who'd spent 15 years in special operations, felt his blood run cold. He'd heard whispers about Blackthorn units. Ghost teams that operated in the spaces between official wars, handling problems that governments couldn't acknowledge. "Jesus," Harrison whispered, so quietly that only his general heard him. "What is it?" the general asked. "That's not a regular army tattoo, sir. That's something else." Meanwhile, Arliston was growing impatient. "Turn him back around. I want to see what else he's hiding." Martinez reached for Brandt's belt buckle, and that's when the guard spoke for the first time. "No." The word cut through the courtyard like a blade. Not loud, not emotional, just absolute. The sound of a man who'd found his line in the sand. Arliston's face flushed. "That's insubordination, soldier. You'll comply with this inspection or face the consequences." Brandt turned to face him, and for the first time his eyes held something other than professional courtesy. Not anger, not fear, something colder. The look of someone who'd been asked to do terrible things in service of his country and had never once refused. "No, sir." The standoff stretched for 5 seconds that felt like 5 minutes. Around the courtyard, people held their breath. The tourists behind the gates pressed closer, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Martinez reached for the belt again, following orders despite his discomfort. Brandt stepped back, just 1 pace, but it was enough to make everyone in the courtyard freeze. The movement was controlled, purposeful, not retreat, repositioning. The stance of someone who'd been trained to handle multiple attackers, who'd learned to read situations before they turned violent. You will comply with this inspection, Arleston snapped, his voice carrying across the courtyard, or face the consequences. I am complying, Brandt replied quietly, his voice steady despite the public humiliation, within the bounds of military law and human dignity. Several things happened at once. The Japanese attaché began filming discreetly, recognizing that he was witnessing either a diplomatic incident or an intelligence operation. The Australian Defence Minister started backing away, suddenly understanding that this wasn't a routine inspection. Sergeant Williams, unable to maintain position while watching a fellow soldier being humiliated, took a half-step forward before catching himself, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. And in the crowd behind the gates, a woman with greying hair and intelligent eyes pulled out her phone and started recording. She'd seen enough military ceremonies to know that this wasn't normal, and something told her it was important to document what was happening. The standoff stretched on, both men locked in a battle of wills that had nothing to do with security and everything to do with power. That's when a voice rang out across the courtyard, sharp, British, and carrying the kind of authority that made colonels stand straighter. What the bloody hell is going on here? Major Graham Bell strode across the flagstones with the purposeful gait of a man who'd spent 30 years turning chaos into order. Behind him, two other officers followed, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes from the Household Division and Captain Reynolds from Palace Security. Bell took in the scene at a glance. The half-dressed guard, the American officers, the crowd of observers, the phones recording everything. His jaw tightened as he processed the implications. "Sergeant Brandt," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Report." "Sir?" Brandt replied, still standing at attention despite being stripped to the waist. "Brigadier General Arleston ordered a security inspection. I complied with uniform removal. I declined further disrobing." Bell's eyes swept the scene, taking in the scars on Brandt's torso, the uncomfortable expressions of the American aides, the crowd of witnesses. Then his gaze fell on Arleston, and his expression hardened. "General, explain yourself." "This man refused a lawful order," Arleston said, trying to regain control of the situation. "I have reasonable suspicion that he's concealing contraband or surveillance equipment." "Based on what evidence?" "His resistance to a thorough inspection, his obvious special operations background, the fact that he's been placed in a position of trust without proper vetting." Bell stepped closer to Brandt, ostensibly to inspect his condition, but really to get a better look at what had caused such a stir. His eyes fell on the tattoo, and his expression changed completely. The geometric pattern was unmistakable to anyone who'd worked in military intelligence. The numbers and letters were a unit designation that didn't appear in any official database. And the placement, directly over the spine, positioned with surgical precision, marked it as something far more significant than a simple military tattoo. "Turn around, Sergeant," Bell said quietly. Brandt complied, and Bell studied the marking more carefully. The three interlocking triangles, the alphanumeric code, the professional quality of the work, all of it told a story that few people were cleared to understand. C3 VI Blackthorn. Bell had heard whispers about Blackthorn units during his time in Afghanistan. Ghost teams that operated in the spaces between wars, handling problems that governments couldn't officially acknowledge. The kind of operations that never appeared in history books. If Brandt carried that mark, it meant he'd been somewhere that didn't exist, fighting enemies that were never officially identified, completing missions that were classified beyond top secret. Bell stepped back and turned to face Arleston. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried the weight of absolute authority. "General, you've just attempted to publicly strip a classified operative in front of international observers and civilian cameras." The words hit the courtyard like a physical blow. Several officers took involuntary steps backward. Even Arleston's aides looked uncomfortable, suddenly understanding that they'd stumbled into something far bigger than a routine security check. I wasn't informed of any special classification, Arleston protested, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. You weren't meant to be, Bell replied. That tattoo represents service in operations that don't appear on any roster you have access to. This man has been places and done things that remain classified at levels above your clearance. He gestured to the nearby guards. Get the sergeant his uniform, now! Sergeant Williams and Corporal Davies moved with crisp efficiency, helping Brandt back into his tunic. They fastened each button with the care of men dressing a statue, their movements precise and respectful. The red wool seemed to transform him back into just another ceremonial guard, but everyone who'd witnessed the last few minutes knew better. Bell never took his eyes off Arleston. You're done here, General. You and your delegation will be escorted from the premises immediately. This is a diplomatic incident, Arleston blustered. I'll be filing formal complaints with the embassy, the Pentagon, NATO command. You'll be filing nothing, Bell cut him off. What just happened here was an attempted security breach by a foreign officer against a classified operative. The fact that you're walking away instead of being arrested is more courtesy than you deserve. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes stepped forward, his expression grim. Sir, I've already contacted the Foreign Office. They're sending a team to handle damage control. And the footage, Bell asked. Captain Reynolds is coordinating with Palace Security. All phones and cameras are being collected under national security protocols. As if on cue, uniformed officers began approaching tourists and observers, politely but firmly requesting that they surrender their devices for routine security screening. Most complied without argument, understanding that this was not a request they could refuse. Security personnel appeared as if from nowhere. MOD officers in plain clothes, palace guards, even a few men in suits who carried themselves like they'd seen combat. They formed a loose circle around the American delegation, not threatening, but unmistakably present. Arleston looked around at the faces surrounding him, all of them professional, all of them unfriendly. His bluster faded as he realized that his authority had evaporated the moment that tattoo came into view. This isn't over, he said weakly. Yes, it is, Bell replied. Captain Martinez approached his superior officer, his face pale. Sir, I need to report something about that tattoo. You need to report nothing, Bell interrupted. You saw nothing. You did nothing. This incident never happened. The captain nodded quickly, understanding that his career depended on his ability to forget the last 30 minutes. As the Americans were escorted away, Bell turned his attention to the other foreign observers. The Canadian general was staring at the ground, clearly uncomfortable with what he'd witnessed. The Australian Defence Minister was checking his phone, probably already fielding calls from Canberra. The Japanese attaché was studying his hands, his expression carefully neutral. Gentlemen, Bell said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. I trust you understand that what you've witnessed here falls under the Official Secrets Act. Any discussion of this incident outside official channels will be considered a breach of national security. Nods all around. No one wanted to be the foreign officer who'd blown a classified operation. The courtyard slowly returned to its normal rhythms, but the atmosphere had changed. The tourists behind the gates were still recording, but palace security was already moving to collect phones and delete footage. The guards resumed their positions, but there was a new tension in their stillness. Brandt finished dressing and retrieved his bearskin hat from where it had been carefully placed on a nearby bench. He positioned it with practiced precision, adjusted his collar, and returned to his post. For the rest of the ceremony, he stood motionless, just another royal guard in red and black, protecting traditions that most people took for granted. But now, everyone who'd witnessed what happened understood something they hadn't before. The stillness wasn't just discipline. The silence wasn't just protocol. The precision wasn't just training. It was the quiet strength of someone who'd earned the right to stand guard over things that mattered. Later that afternoon, in a secure office deep within the palace complex, Bell filed his report. The document would be classified at levels that made most government secrets look like newspaper articles. But the key points were clear. Foreign dignity had been preserved, classified information had been protected, and a good soldier had been allowed to do his job with the respect he deserved. The incident would generate paperwork at levels most people couldn't imagine. Phone calls were already being made to Washington, Canberra, Ottawa, and Tokyo. Diplomatic notes would be exchanged. Career trajectories would be altered. But Bell's immediate concern was practical. He picked up his secure phone and dialed a number that didn't appear in any directory. "This is Bell at the Palace. I need immediate consultation on a Blackthorn operative. Yes, I know the classification level. No, the security wasn't breached, but we had a close call." He listened for a moment, his expression growing more serious. "Understood. What about the American who tried to expose him?" "I see. And his current operational status. Copy that. Thank you." He hung up and stared at the phone for a long moment. Then he walked to his window and looked out at the courtyard where Brandt stood at his post, as motionless as a statue. The conversation he'd just had confirmed what he'd suspected. Brandt wasn't just a former special operations soldier doing ceremonial duty. He was an active asset, using his position as cover for ongoing intelligence work. The kind of work that kept threats away from the royal family and the British government. And some American general had nearly blown his cover because he wanted to prove a point about security. Bell made another call, this one to the American embassy. "This is Major Bell from the Palace. I need to speak to your military attaché now." The conversation that followed was brief and professional, but the message was clear. Brigadier General Alston would be returning to Washington immediately, and his future assignments would be limited. Meanwhile, in the barracks, word of what had happened was spreading through the guards in the way that important information always did, quietly, carefully, but inevitably. Sergeant Williams found himself in the mess hall, surrounded by younger soldiers who'd heard fragments of the story and wanted to know more. "All I can tell you," he said quietly, "is that the man you see standing guard out there has done things that most of us can't imagine, and he does it without asking for recognition or respect." Corporal Davies nodded. You could see it in his eyes, the way he stood there while they stripped him down. No anger, no fear. Just professional. "Professional doesn't cover it," Williams replied. "That was the bearing of someone who's been through hell and decided it was just another day at the office." One of the younger guardsmen, barely 20, fresh from training, spoke up. "What do you think that tattoo meant?" Williams was quiet for a long moment. "I think it means he's one of the ones who do the jobs that let the rest of us sleep at night. And I think we're lucky to have him watching over us." The conversation ended there, but the respect remained. From that day forward, no one in the guards would question Brandt's right to stand among them. His silence, his stillness, his absolute professionalism, it all made sense now. 3 days later, Brandt was back at his post for the morning ceremony. Same position, same perfect posture, same watchful stillness. Tourists took pictures, dignitaries made polite conversation, and the ancient rhythms of palace life continued unchanged. But the British intelligence services had quietly updated their protocols. Foreign observers would be more carefully screened. Security briefings would include warnings about classified personnel, and certain tattoos would be added to the list of markings that required immediate notification to higher authorities. The woman who'd filmed the confrontation, a retired teacher named Margaret Thornton, had her phone confiscated by palace security. But she'd already uploaded the footage to a cloud server, and copies were spreading across social media faster than the authorities could track them down. Within hours, the video had been viewed millions of times. Comments poured in from around the world, most of them expressing outrage at the treatment of the guard. Military veterans recognized the signs, the scars, the bearing, the controlled response to provocation. But then the video disappeared. Taken down by court order, deleted from servers, scrubbed from the internet as if it had never existed. The official explanation was national security concerns, but most people understood that they'd witnessed something the government didn't want them to see. Margaret Thornton received a visit from two polite gentlemen in suits who explained that her footage had accidentally captured classified information. They offered her a choice: sign a non-disclosure agreement and accept a generous compensation package or face prosecution under the Official Secrets Act. She chose the money and the silence. But she never forgot what she'd seen. The way the guard had stood there, stripped half naked in front of strangers, maintaining his dignity while others tried to take it away. The quiet strength that needed no words, no explanations, no justification. Months later, she would tell her grandchildren about the day she saw a real hero. Not the kind from movies or books, but the kind who stood quietly at the edges of the world, protecting things that mattered without asking for recognition. And in the palace, Lance Sergeant Callum Brandt continued his watch. Silent, still, and ready for whatever came next. Because that's what guards do. They protect what matters, even when nobody understands the cost. Especially when nobody understands the cost. The tattoo on his spine remained hidden beneath his uniform, a reminder of service that would never be publicly acknowledged. But those who knew, knew, and that was enough. In the end, respect isn't demanded, it's earned, and sometimes the people who've earned it the most are the ones who stand quietest at the edges of your world, watching over things you never think about until they're gone. Have you ever seen someone judged for their silence, only to discover their quiet strength ran deeper than anyone imagined? No? Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. If this story made you think twice about the people who stand quietly at the edges of your world, hit that like button and subscribe. We share stories like this every day about the heroes who never ask for recognition and the strength that doesn't need to announce itself. Your next story is already waiting.